Our next speaker is Sean Moreland, who's come all the way from Ottawa, I believe. So a long trip from Canada. He is not only an academic in English literature, he is also a practitioner of artistic uses of the English language. So I expect lots from this.
Well, I hope I don't plummet your expectations too heavily.
You can do an academic talk then.
Yeah. This is it's. Yeah. And I guess if you don't have much interest in 18th century history and literature, it's probably also going to be rather tedious. But there are a lot of connections with some of the figures who've come up in previous talks, and particularly actually with Ken's. There are a lot of commonalities, since the fictions I'm looking at are both 18th century Gothic novels, heavily influenced by Scottish Enlightenment and particularly by Hume's skepticism. So my paper is called The Daimonic Republic, Mesmerism, Delusion and Demagoguery in the Gothic Romances of Charles Brockden Brown. Brockden Brown was a Philadelphian who was one of the first professional novelists in the newly United States. So this is, less than a decade after the formation of the Constitution and the unification of the first of the states. An important and too often overlooked precursor to the better-known writers of the American Renaissance, Brown's first novels transplant many of the tropes of 18th century Gothic fiction, adapting them to particularly American political concerns and using them to raise questions about human knowledge and the power of the imagination in ways that anticipate later 19th century authors of dark romanticism, whose names are likely to be more familiar to you. E.T.A. Hoffman, for example, Mary Shelley, Nathaniel Hawthorne, or, of course, Edgar Allan Poe. Brown's early novels reveal a consistent fascination with the daimonic, which they use as a device to foreground questions concerning contemporary concepts of the imagination and of the unconscious. This paper particularly examines the presentation of the human imagination as a daimonic power, particularly focusing on two of Brown's novels, Wieland, which was published in 1798, and Edgar Huntley, which was published in 1799. Has anybody read either of these novels? I figured that was a long shot. If you didn't, if you weren't a student of 18th century American literature, they're probably not the first thing you're going to turn to for entertainment, to be honest. So I'll provide just a bit of explanatory context. Wieland, which was Brown's first published novel, takes as its inspiration a 1784 murder trial which occurred in New York of a man named James Yates. And basically the case which Brown had read about in a New York newspaper was about a man who had murdered his wife, his children, and who had attempted to murder his sister after throwing a Bible on the fire. And he claimed that he received an auditory and a visual vision from God, which he accepted as a true revelation of the divine person, which instructed him that the Bible was basically idolatry. It was worshiping the Word rather than the Spirit of God. He should throw it on the flames, and that subsequently in an act which kind of perversely echoes, I guess it's the 6th book of Genesis, when Abraham is asked to sacrifice his son Isaac, he's then asked by this manifestation to offer up his own family to show his tremendous faith in God, which he faithfully does. His sister manages to escape and testifies against him, and Brown takes this as the starting point for his novel, which is written by a fictional character named Clara Wieland, whose brother Theodore Wieland takes the place of the James Yates figure in the story. But Brown changes the story in one really particular way, in that he introduces a character named Carwyn, who is an Irish immigrant who basically you learn about halfway through the book practices what he calls biloquism, which we would know as ventriloquism. He's able to throw and manipulate his voice in an almost supernatural fashion. So like the Gothic novels of Anne Radcliffe, the book sets up all of these expectations of supernatural occurrences. There are ghostly auditions coming from closets and abandoned buildings and so on. And it also adds this other level of obfuscation over the James James Yates' case by creating at least the remote possibility that Carwin had provided Theodore Wieland with the instructions to murder his family, in which case, forensically speaking, Carwin would be responsible for their murders rather than Theodore Wieland, who really didn't understand what he was doing. Some critics read the novel as being more of a kind of forensic work of detective fiction that invites the reader to reach that conclusion. Other critics, and I tend to side with them, really emphasize the degree to which the novel doesn't provide any sufficient evidence to come to this conclusion, and it really leaves things shrouded in a great deal of ambiguity. So the novel repeatedly underscores the proximity of the homicidal Theodore Wieland's experiences to notions of religious revelation generally, rather than emphasizing the singularity of Wieland's case and suggesting that this is just an isolated incident. The novel draws numerous links between his beliefs and those of the majority of Christians, and in fact, the religiously faithful in general. And at this early point in his life, Brown, who was raised a Quaker, was vehemently anti-Christian. Really believed that Christianity was a tremendous deleterious influence that we would have to get rid of in order to attain a kind of more Enlightenment social ideal. It draws links between his beliefs, between Theodore Wieland's beliefs and those of the majority of Christians, and in this it reflects Brown's youthful Jeffersonian and deist sensibilities. The novel particularly problematizes the idea of language, whether verbal or written, as a medium of divine or daimonic expression. And the novel really foregrounds the daimonic by having Theodore Wieland be obsessed with Socrates' daemon, right? This voice which Socrates claims tells him what not to do, but never tells him what to do, which is often aligned with, the kind of more modern concept of the conscience. In this, it shares a common preoccupation with the skepticism articulated by Publius, which was the corporate pseudonym of Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, who authored the Federalist Papers in 1787 to 1788, encouraging the citizens of New York to ratify the proposed Constitution, upon which an American centralized government would be established. For example, the 37th number of the Federalist Papers remarks that, quote, "When the Almighty himself condescends to address mankind in their own language, his meaning, luminous as it must be, is rendered dim and doubtful by the cloudy medium through which he is communicated," end quote. Brown's novel takes the consequences of acting upon such dim communications to the extreme in its presentation of religious revelation as fatal delusion, a perspective informed by his reading of an early admiration for the thought and writings of William Godwin, Thomas Paine, and Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson once famously wrote that the God of the Old Testament, if it existed, would have to be recognized as a cruel, unjust, jealous, and irrational being. However, as critic Stephen Watts observes, in Wieland, quote, "This theme assumed a specific form, a devastating critique of 18th century rationalism based on sensory impressions. From the time of John Locke's essay on human understanding, most enlightened intellectuals in the Atlantic world agreed that human beings were the passive recipients of sensory impressions that became the basis for all thought. With its emphasis on the lack of innate ideas and the ordering of sensory signals as the mind's function, this sensationalist psychology placed an enormous stress on human reason. As one of Brown's characters put it, end quote. As one of Brown's characters put it, the senses of sight and hearing were, to quote Clara Wieland, the most explicit and unerring of those which support the fabric of human knowledge, end quote. Wieland's repeated undermining of the reliability of human perception affects a powerful critique of this viewpoint, for Clara Wieland also states in the course of the novel that ideas exist in our minds that can be accounted for by no established laws, which is an explicit rejection of Locke's insistence that there are, quote, no ideas but from sensation or reflection. So one of the things that I argue in my paper on Brown is that really he's anticipated a lot of what will come to be called the unconscious in 19th century discourse. So while Locke proposed that the mind, quote, the mind is fitted to receive the impression made on it, either through the senses, by outward objects, or by its own operations when it reflects on them, end quote, Wieland demonstrates how potentially ill-fitted the human mind is for such operations, precisely because of our periodic inability to differentiate our sensations from our reflections. The novel thus fictionally embodies the skepticism toward the transparency of human perceptual powers, which was formulated by Scottish philosopher David Hume, who observed that, quote, in sleep, in a fever, in madness, or in any very violent emotions of the soul, our ideas may approach to our impressions, end quote. What writers from Pseudo-Longinus onward called the sublime, defined by just such a violent emotion of the soul, represents an aesthetic encounter wherein our experience of an idea becomes indistinguishable from our perceptual impressions. And if you read most of the 18th century commentators on the sublime, this is something that, interestingly, they all have in common, from John Dennis to Addison, right up to Burke, and later on to Kant. Stephen Watts points to the relation between this critical dimension in Wieland and the broader context of the late 18th century novel, observing that, quote, the novel appeared as the first great popularizer of issues raised by the sensationalist psychology of the Lockean and Scottish traditions, end quote. But the epistemological concerns of Wieland, as well as Brown's next novel, Edgar Huntley, also partook of more specifically American political concerns. The skeptical picture of human understanding that Brown's fictions paint, a picture that will serve as a key inspiration for the dark romantic visions of Poe, Hawthorne, and Melville, reflects the pessimistic view of human nature articulated by Publius. As historian Benjamin Wright explains, quote, there is no aspect of the reasoning in the Federalist quite so central and so pervasive as the theory of the nature of man held by its authors, which is one of the foundations, sometimes the entire foundation, upon which the authors of the letters erect their defense of the Constitution. If we premise a different set of human motives and a different pattern of behavior, their defense of the Constitution has little validity, end quote. Indeed, for all the political differences that inform Madison and Hamilton's views, they're united in their assumptions concerning, quote, the fallibility and defects of human nature, end quote. It's no coincidence that Brown's writings exhibit such a sustained interest in what could be called abnormal psychology, religious delusions, manipulative ventriloquism, somnambulism, autoscopy, visual and auditory hallucinations. Brown's investment in these conditions and in the Gothic as a literary mode is directly linked to his political and philosophical sensibilities and his suspicion of the prospects of popular government. After all, if any given individual will tend to be irrational and will have unreliable perceptions of reality, how much worse than, you know, the group, the mob, the kind of mass. Recognizing the commonalities between Brown's views and those of Publius, Eric Savoy notes, quote, the essentially conservative nature of Brown's American Gothic. By raising doubts about the ability of individuals to govern themselves in a full-fledged democracy, Brown participates in Hamilton's state-oriented federalist skepticism about the realizability of Thomas Jefferson's confidence in supposedly free individualism, end quote. However, as the political and epistemological shift evident in both Brown's letters and his novels suggest, his interest in these phenomena seems to have led to, rather than been motivated by, his eventual rejection of Locke, Godwin, and Paine's ideas, and his increasingly Hamiltonian, conservative, I guess, to use a kind of anachronistic imposition, political views. One of the textual touchstones for this shift can be found in the report of the commissaire chargé par le roi de l'examen du magnétisme animal. So this is the report that the French king commissioned when Mesmer was in Paris and was demonstrating animal magnetism, which was sort of headed by Lavoisier, but Ben Franklin, quite famously, was one of the members of the commission. The report, corporately authored by 5 commissioners, including Franklin, was commissioned at the height of the craze for magnetism sparked by Mesmer's almost evangelical demonstrations in Paris, and it claims to debunk Mesmer's claims of miraculous cures attributable to the manipulations of a universal magnetic fluid, instead attributing the effects of the so-called mesmeric crisis to, quote, a distinguished effect of the influence of imagination. So, basically the placebo effect, the power of suggestion, which interestingly raises questions about the dangers of the imagination, which in a discussion of Gothic fiction, fantastic literature, is something to bear in mind. One of the more interesting conclusions reached by the report's authors concerns the association they identify between what Mesmer called magnetic crises and the effects of popular literature, theater, and, of course, demagoguery. Demagogues stir up the public passions through their speeches. The report reads, and this is a really lengthy quote, by little and little the impressions are communicated from one to another and reinforced by the same manner as the impressions which are made by theatrical representation. And just note the very Lockean quality of those phrases, right? The impressions of the senses, as though something is sort of being imposed upon, impressed upon the mind, where the impressions are greater in proportion to the number of the spectators and the liberty they enjoy of expressing their sensations. The applause by which the emotions of individuals are announced occasions a general emotion everyone partakes in to the degree in which he is susceptible. The same observation has been made upon armies on the day of battle, where the enthusiasms of courage as well as the impressions of terror are propagated with so amazing rapidity. The drum, the sound of the military musical instruments, the noise of the cannon, the musketry, the shouts of the army, and the general disorder, and again, impress upon the organs, have a uniform effect upon the understanding and exalt the imagination in the same degree. In this equilibrium of inebriation, the external manifestation of a single sensation immediately becomes universal. It hurries the soldiery to the charge, or it determines them to fly. The same cause is deeply concerned in rebellions. The multitude are governed by the imagination. The individuals in a numerous assembly are more subjected to their senses and less capable of submitting to the dictates of reason, end quote. So the connection there with the Federalist and the emphasis on the need for a strong central government as opposed to popular government is probably fairly obvious. So the report's very Lockean language is loosely echoed in a number of passages throughout the course of the Federalist Papers, as Publius provides ample caveats against the danger posed by demagogues and other stirrers of the popular passions. And while listening to your paper, I was struck by the etymology of telepathy, right, which would literally be like the transmission of pathos, the transmission of the passions, as opposed to the transmission of thought. After all, one of the central tenets of the Federalist is that, quote, the danger of disturbing the public tranquility by interesting too strongly the public passions is a still more serious objection against a frequent reference of constitutional questions to the decision of the whole society, end quote. So, we want a government by the people, for the people, but not one that's actually really literally by the people, for the people. We require responsible, sober, and rational mediators to act as their representatives. Brown's Edgar Huntley echoes both, as in keeping with the Royal Commission and Benjamin Franklin's suspicion of mesmeric cures, Brown's narrative suggestively undermines the therapeutic efficacy of such a crisis, as well as undermining the faith in individual reason and perception, and by extension in popular judgment, tracing Brown's trajectory again away from Paine, Godwin, and Jefferson. And just to very briefly summarize Edgar Huntley, which is even more bizarre and torturous in its construction than Brown's earlier novel, it's about a guy named Edgar Huntley whose friend Waldegrave has been murdered by somebody that has remained uncaught and unidentified. The whole thing is an epistolary novel that he's writing to the woman that he hopes to marry, whose name is Mary, so she's sort of the narratee, the recipient of the narrative. While out walking by the tree where his friend Waldegrave was murdered one night, Edgar Huntley sees this mysterious stranger who's weeping and digging a pit beneath the tree, and he decides this must be the murderer. He's been driven back to the scene of his crime. So he follows him through the wilderness for a good day and a half, ends up following him into these subterranean catacombs where he sees this gorgeous, huge sort of subterranean spring, a water fountain kind of thing, eventually only to realize that the man is not, doesn't have his wits about him, so to speak. He's actually somnambulant. He's a sleepwalker. And at a later point in the novel, Huntley, the narrator, realizes that he himself is also now a sleepwalker. So there's this sort of idea that he may have caught sleepwalking somehow from this other character, which the novel portrays portrays as a kind of double. It's really unclear to what extent we're supposed to see these as two very distinct, independent, sort of psychologically discrete characters, and to what extent they're meant to be doubles or reflections of one another. And there's a lot that the novel provides on both sides of that kind of reading that ambiguates it further. So, Ian Hacking, in his book Multiple Personality and the Sciences of Memory, writes that Lavoisier's commission, quote, determined that there was no substance to Mesmer's claims. Mesmerism was consigned to the level of the popular marvel, not unlike the Gothic novel, where it played a significant role in underground anti-establishment movements leading up to 1789, end quote. It's partly the significance of Mesmerism as a popular marvel associated with Jacobinism and pre-revolutionary anti-establishment movements that link it to the Gothic novel and that underline the connection between the daimonic and the popular in Brown's Gothic fictions. For somebody who wrote popular Gothic fictions, he was clearly quite suspicious about the possible effects of titillating the public imagination and stirring the public passions, which is perhaps why later in his career he became largely a pamphleteer and stopped writing fiction. Okay. So, according to the American critic Leslie Fiedler, quote, in the American Gothic, the heathen unredeemed wilderness and not the decaying monuments of a dying class, nature and not society becomes the symbol of evil. Similarly, not the aristocrat but the Indian, not the dandified courtier but the savage colored man is postulated as the embodiment of villainy. Our novel of terror, that is to say, even before its founder, he's speaking of Brown, has consciously shifted his political allegiances, is well on the way to becoming a Calvinist expose of natural human corruption rather than an enlightened attack on a debased ruling class or entrenched superstition, end quote. So something really significant there happens in terms of the kind of epistemological orientation of Gothic fiction from the works of, say, Anne Radcliffe and Matthew Lewis to Charles Brockden Brown and really all of the American Gothic authors that are influenced by him. Okay, the challenges of Edgar Huntley, the novel Edgar Huntley's epistolary logic, are compounded by the fact that, as Fiedler has also pointed out, quote, the boundaries between person and person are abrogated. People are always turning into each other, end quote. Huntley and Edney are portrayed as individual characters, but at times the narrative suggests that they're divided expressions of the same mind, and this is something that Edgar Allan Poe will play with extensively in many of his short fictions. Similarly, language itself is deployed throughout the novel in a protean fashion, as the formal characteristics of words often suggest what you could call, drawing on Freudian terminology, cathexes. And one really interesting example, and actually I think one of the inspirations for this was a phrase from Hume about the springs of human motivation. There's that underground spring I mentioned where Huntley first follows Edney, and then later on in the novel he discovers this trunk that he's sure will contain documents, if he can get it open, that will reveal that Edney was in fact the murderer of this character Waldegrave, but he breaks a spring in trying to open it. So much as Freud identifies language as operating by this kind of condensation of meaning in the dream work, Brown is in the late 18th century playing with this element, this kind of morphological continuity to make these sorts of thematic connections and to create a kind of dreamlike texture to the novel. And again, in Ian Hacking's book, he writes, quote, the prototype of the double in romantic fiction was furnished by Hoffman, James Hogg, and Robert Louis Stevenson, all of whom wrote about men, but all of whom were also well acquainted with the relevant medical literature and with experts who knew that women, not men, were the doubles, end quote. And it's interesting that he, of course, doesn't mention Brown in this connection, even though he would certainly fit in with that company. Hacking's drawing attention to the fact that virtually all the early clinical cases exhibiting apparently multiple personalities were women, while these notable fictional explorations of seemingly similar phenomena featured male protagonists. While literary and cultural convention can account for much of this, in the case of Brown's prototypical novel of doubling, clinical verisimilitude is also at issue. Huntley's identity not only echoes his literary precursor, Caleb Williams, the character from William Godwin's novel, but is also influenced by the novel's investment in the psychological case study of the late 18th century. Just as Brown's alterations to Godwin's fictional model were informed by his incorporation of contemporary clinical writings, Huntley's age, sex, and personality are also informed by Brown's familiarity with medical and philosophical writings on somnambulism, which he studied extensively while working on the novel. As James Cowles Pritchard observed in 1835, many early 19th century psychologists considered somnambulism as, quote, chiefly incident to the male sex and to the early period of manhood, end quote. In Brown's case, though, there was also an autobiographical investment in making his protagonist a character of the same sex and of a similar age to the author. As Sidney Krause has explored, quote, Brown was actually merging or barely separating the characters of Huntley and Edney. And further, that this doubling can be doubly read as both a fictional and a metafictional theme. He explains that, quote, given to writing by immersion, Brown spoke of his consciousness of a double mental existence, the imaginative, creative, and the social. And regarding the former, he observed, when I am sufficiently excited to write, all my ideas flow naturally and irresistibly through the medium of sympathies, which steep them in shade, end quote. And to read Brown's own accounts, his sort of phenomenological accounts of the act of writing, is in a way to see a kind of anticipation of much of the stuff that Robert Louis Stevenson will claim about the writing experience. The fact that when he's writing creatively, he already seems to have multiple minds, multiple personalities in a certain sense. Okay. So, there's a striking parallel evident between the French Commission's conclusions about mesmerism and Brown's skepticism, the way that he portrays mesmerism in his novel. And one of these is that Brown is clearly very interested in the idea that clairvoyance, that abilities that exceed those of the waking mind, are visited upon the somnambulator. But at the same time, he remains really skeptical of these possibilities. And to quote Henri Ellenberger, Mesmer had already spoken of a sixth sense revealed in sensitivity to the magnetic fluid. Puységur had added that this sixth sense provided humans the ability of describing distant events and predicting future happenings. The Romantics now assumed that somnambulic lucidity would enable the human mind to establish communication with the world soul, end quote. And it's this idea that Brown's novel really seems to play with, but also to undermine in various ways. This belief, which would, well after the Commission's report, continue to exert a tremendous influence on Poe, Margaret Fuller, and to a lesser extent Ralph Waldo Emerson in terms of American letters, informs many of Brown's ecstatic passages about the powers conferred upon him by his strange condition. It also suggests that much as the reading of German romances is imbricated with the disastrous events of Wieland's plot, Huntley's plot is dug from the Urgrund of a German romantic Weltanschauung. So it's really heavily invested in this kind of German romantic picture of an organic, unified, unus mundus, one which is revealed by the novel to be at base both fascinating vision, but ultimately, more importantly for Brown, a delusive dream. In light of the supernatural prescience associated with somnambulism through its relationship with mesmerism, it becomes possible to read Edgar Huntley as a play on Godwin's suggestion in his essay of History and Romance, the title of which is echoed by one of Brown's own essays called Of Romance and History, inventively enough, that, quote, and this is Godwin, the romance writer is continually straining at a foresight to which his faculties are incompetent, and continually fails, end quote. The connection between the psychic exigencies of romance writing and the perceived prescience of the somnambulist would not have been lost on Brown. Again, according to Hacking, quote, the French literature of somnambulism, being so intimately linked to mesmerism and then to the occult, had many stories of abnormal perception. It began innocently enough with the observation that somnambules got around just fine in the dark and in no time at all could see at a distance or into the future. That's the origin of our word clairvoyance for psychic abilities to tell the future. The British physicians, mostly products of the Edinburgh Medical School, with its strong tradition of Scottish empirical and so-called common sense philosophy, did not believe such ideas for a moment, end quote. However, as Susan Manning has illustrated, this is something of an oversimplification. She explains, quote, "In the course of the 18th century, the current of Scottish thinking about the nature and provenance of dreams moved away from a demonological proclivity that explained them as the creations of spirits acting externally in the sleeping mind toward the expanding compass of sense-based psychology and physiology," end quote. And at least to some degree, Freud can be seen as sort of furthering that trend, whereas Jung, in a way, is moving backwards to the sort of pre-Scottish, more mystical apprehension of some of these phenomena. So, as Huntley warns his readers, quote, "Thou wilt catch from my story every horror and every sympathy which it paints," end quote. His use of the term catch, with its suggestion of both communicative receptivity and communicable infection, reflects a commonplace of the late 18th century, which, in Caleb Crane's words, was, quote, "to compare the spread of sympathy to the spread of disease. All our affections and passions," Francis Hutcheson wrote, "seem naturally contagious." Similarly, end quote, similarly, in a treatise of human nature, Hume claimed that, quote, "the passions are so contagious that they pass with the greatest facility from one person to another and produce correspondent movements in all human breasts." Following a similar line of reasoning in his enquiry into the origins of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful, Edmund Burke described the effects of sublime language by writing that, quote, "by the contagion of our passions, we catch a fire already kindled in another," end quote. And obviously the influence that these ideas have on both Charles Brockden Brown's fictions and on the Federalists and the kind of arguments that they were using against the feasibility of popular government are, I think, pretty clear. One of the qualities that makes both Wieland and Edgar Huntley so perennially fascinating, at least to 18th century American lit nerds like myself, my undergrad students don't often share my enthusiasm for Brown's fictions, is precisely their ability to thoughtfully and persuasively dramatize the daimonic dimensions of the human mind. As the Federalist 37 states, quote, "the faculties of the mind itself have never yet been distinguished and defined with satisfactory precision by all the efforts of the most acute and metaphysical philosophers," end quote. In giving literary form to the anxieties this recognition entails, Brown broke a path that would be followed by not only the great naysayers of the American Renaissance, Poe, Melville, and Hawthorne, but also the great British 19th century Gothic novelists from Mary Shelley to Bram Stoker. So I'll conclude there.